All information contained in this podcast is general in nature and does not consider your individual circumstances. You should consider the appropriateness of this information with regards to your individual objectives, financial situation, and needs. Welcome to Sharing More Than the Sheets, a podcast to help you and your partner make better financial and lifestyle decisions so that you can both focus on the things that you love. I'm your host, Michael Khouri, financial planner, green thumb, husband, and just dad. This episode is part of a series where I interview experts on various areas around mental health. If you or someone you know is in crisis and needs help now, call 000 Lifeline on 13 11 14 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46 36 anytime for support and advice. Experiencing a traumatic event or a traumatic moment can have a long-lasting impact on someone's life. That could be because of the industry or the profession that you work in, or it could be something that's occurred in your life. Today, I've invited Danielle Baldock onto the show to talk about navigating life after trauma. Danielle, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's, when I was doing some research on yourself and on your background as well, I saw that you're very involved in this area, and there's a bit of background as to why you do that, and there's also a organization that you've set up called Soldiers and Sirens. Can you maybe start by just talking a bit about your background and Soldiers and Sirens, and for those that haven't heard about it?
Sure. So I started off, I started off going to university out of school and not really knowing what to do with myself. And as I went through an arts degree, because that looked fun, I realized that I really loved psychology. And so I took on more and more psychology units and ended up graduating with a Bachelor of Psychology. And then I wasn't really sure what to do with it at first. But my dad was a RAF psych, so Royal Australian Air Force psychologist. And so I was thinking about, could I do something similar? It's funny now because at the time I thought I don't really want to join the military. So I joined the WA Police instead. Originally, I went into recruiting and I said, I want to be a criminal profiler. And they told me there's not enough crime in Perth for that. So I joined up as an officer instead. I served for 6 years in WA Police, and the last place I was as a police prosecutor in the Magistrates Court, which I absolutely loved. But I got out because my last position in prosecuting was as the drug court prosecutor. And drug court's a really unique therapeutic court in which people have 6 months to 12 months to turn their lives around. So these are people who've, committed offences in which drugs were part of those offences. So they might have, stolen, taken people's credit cards, done burglaries, all sorts of things to finance their drug habits. And so this court was about them pleading guilty and then taking time to see what they could achieve with the court's help in that time. And then at the end, their sentence, which might have been custodial, might change to a community-based order or something like that, because they were now, I saw people get back into the workplace, I saw people start studying, I saw people get their families and their children back together, I saw people start playing sport, all sorts of amazing things with the assistance of the court. And I thought, this is what I want to do in my life with my psychology degree and now my experience as a police officer. I want to do something else. So I got out of the police wanting to use my psychology degree, and I started working at the Sexual Assault Resource Centre, which was a good kind of bridge between policing and psychology, because I was still interacting with lots of police and looking after victims of sexual assault and sexual abuse. And I am still there. So started working there in 2008 and I'm still there now. During that period of time, I worked at lots of different places, all, I guess, related to crime, to trauma, and to those organisations that respond to those things. So police, I went back as a psychologist into the health and safety unit there. I went and became the manager of victim support and child witness service in the courts, and lots of different jobs like that. And eventually ended up as the soldier on psychologist, where I was seeing lots and lots of police officers. And I also got to start seeing veterans and current serving military personnel. And while I understood the policing experience, I didn't really understand the military experience. And so I joined the army. Yeah, really absolutely love working with that population of people who've served, having served myself and still serving. But what I saw was that while the military has great services, they've got Department of Veteran Affairs to fund the things that they need. They have Open Arms, which is a national counselling service. The police, fire and ambulance didn't have a service that was specific to them. And we kept on hearing stories from people about how they went to a civilian psychologist and they tried to share their trauma, but they were told that the person wasn't qualified to help them, or the clinician cried when they told one of the stories they thought was the least traumatic. And as people who serve their community and their country, the last thing they want to do when they've been protecting the community is harm the community with their trauma. So myself and another ex-police officer, Danielle Bates, we decided we needed to do something about this. And at the time as well, there was a lot of police suicides happening across the country. And we just thought, this has to stop. We have to do something about this. So initially, we just started a Facebook page to see if anybody would be interested in this concept. And we got lots and lots and lots of followers all of a sudden, and we realised how big the demand was out there in the community. So we set ourselves up properly as a not-for-profit charity. We got a board, all of the things that you need to do. And we got a federal government grant as well. And we hired some other current and ex-serving people. And we started looking after mental health and also health as well, well-being of these special communities. And in addition, we added corrections officers into that community because we realised that they're the forgotten front line. So we don't really hear about them much in the media. I think the general public wants to pretend that once people are in prison that they've disappeared. But they see just as many horrific incidents as our police officers and our military personnel.
Yeah, wow. So it sounds like it's your work experience combined with your work experience. So your work experience combined with your education that's sort of probably pushed you towards this particular topic. Because you've got a Bachelor of Psychology. You're currently a therapy manager at the Marion Center. You're a registered psychologist, and there's that, and there's also the experiences of talking to people that have suffered traumatic events. And I think that's so really from your point of view, you're not just coming at it from an educational perspective, you're coming at it from a life experience point of view, which I think is so powerful. Because when someone is going through, when someone's suffering PTSD, you could have 10 degrees under your belt and you could have read the best books, but unless you've actually been in that scenario or experienced at least similar things to that person, it's so hard to relate to it. To those that probably have heard of PTSD, but don't really understand what it actually is, can you maybe give a little bit of context around PTSD and some of its characteristics?
Sure. And what you say also about lived experience, I think, is 100% accurate. And lived experience peer workers are the next thing that's coming into mental health. And I'm really excited to see it because you just build instant rapport with people and you really understand what they're talking about, where they've come from, and you have a shared language as well, which is amazing. In psychology world, when we have to make a diagnosis, and this is for doctors, psychiatrists, some psychologists make diagnoses, There's two different, I don't know what you would call them, but there's two different ways of doing that. The one that we use in Australia is the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It comes from America. And we also have the ICD-10 is the alternate version. PTSD in the ICD-10 is much gentler, but we don't use that one in Australia. So PTSD in the DSM-5 is in the traumatic disorders category. And there's different criterion that you have to meet in order to get that diagnosis. So some people have a lot of the symptoms, but when they go to their psychiatrist, they might not, may not quite meet criteria. So that's important to know as well. So the first one, criterion A, is about the trauma itself. And it has to be exposure to death, threatened death, or actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence. And it has to have happened to the person themselves, so they directly were exposed to that. They witnessed it, so you can imagine in some of the conflict zones that we've had that Australian soldiers, sailors and airmen may have witnessed things happening and not been able to engage because of their rules of engagement at the time. Learning that a relative or a close friend was exposed to the trauma, or indirect exposure because of your professional duties. So this is where police, paramedics, firefighters, prison officers are exposed. And often in civilian world, somebody might have had one thing happen. So they might have had a sexual assault, or they might have had a car crash. But with first responders and military, what we see is a cumulative effect of these day after day after day. So that's criterion A. You have to have that for the diagnosis of PTSD. The next thing that happens is that our brains are wired for survival. So if something bad happens to us, our brains say, right, I need to remember this. It's important because it might help me survive if I ever see something similar. So what happens then is our brains remind us about that traumatic thing. And part of it is trying to process what happened and make sense of it, because often when something traumatic happens to us, our senses are completely overwhelmed and we're acting on instinct and we're not laying down memories in a nice chronological order. So we might have a tiny flash of an image, or we might have a sound we remember, or a smell, or something like that. So we might have flashes of things in traumatic memory, and they might not be nicely in a story. So our brain is trying to put things into a story so that it can put it away into our memory bank. But because the thing was traumatic, we don't want to think about it. And the intrusion symptoms could be memories, could be nightmares, could be flashbacks, also physical reactivity and emotional distress. So sometimes people have internal triggers as well that happen. So we have these intrusion things going on. And of course, that makes us feel awful because we don't want to think about the trauma in the first place. And then our brain's trying to help us process it by reminding us all the time. So, of course, the natural thing to do is avoid, which is criterion C, which is avoidance. And it means we start avoiding anything that reminds us about that trauma. So it might be people, places and things, but it could also be emotions, thoughts. And what happens as well in our brain is that we generalize out. So say in the trauma, there was a guy wearing a red hat. Then every time we see a red hat, our brain will go on high alert and say, oh my gosh, is that traumatic thing going to happen to us again? So that's where we generalize out. We might have triggers that maybe don't make sense at first. You can also have internal triggers or body triggers where you might move your arm in a certain way and suddenly you get a flashback. And you don't, in conscious memory, connect that you moved your arm in that way during the trauma, but your body remembers. And all this is just, pretty exhausting and pretty awful. So criterion D is that we get negative alterations in cognition and mood. So that means the way we think about ourselves, the world, and other people starts to get quite negative. And also we feel pretty bad. And because we're avoiding, we start isolating ourselves away from other people. We avoid the things that used to, give us joy and make us happy, because there might be people there might be triggers there, and we're really exhausted as well. And people often start to struggle with feeling any positive emotions. I think part of it is that when we need to shut down anger and fear, then we get what we call restricted emotional range. So we lose those negative emotions so that we can cope and function day to day. But what happens is we lose the positive ones too, like excitement and joy and love, which is really difficult. And that's where it's also, while the person experiencing all of this is feeling awful, their family and friends watching this is also, starting to get really worried, seeing all of this going on. And then because our body's on high alert for danger, it's in permanent fight-flight mode potentially, then we feel pretty irritable and aggressive because we're jumpy, easily startled, looking for threats and getting ready to fight them or to run away. So there's that hypervigilance, the heightened startle reaction. And of course, if your brain is on fight-flight and it's looking for danger and trying to keep itself safe, you can't concentrate. So people often report difficulties with memory, difficulties with focus, and difficulties sleeping. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because if you're in a dangerous situation, the last thing you want to do is go to sleep, because that's not going to keep you safe. So really people struggle with sleep, and it's very, very difficult to look after our sleep.
And in also, I mean, you mentioned avoidance, and to me, I think something from, because I've talking to people and some clients that have suffered, that have suffered and still suffer, PTSD. They do avoid things that give them joy and make them happy, and just like, I guess you can say in any mental illness, but especially PTSD. It's one of those things where it tends to have a bit of a snowball effect, doesn't it? Because if it's not managed well, it can just get worse and worse and escalate, and other issues can start coming up, like lack of, that can come from lack of social interaction, etc.
And it is such a complex thing, and it all feeds into itself as well.
With the appreciation that every situation is different and every person's circumstance is different, can I ask, how do you approach PTSD when you're talking to somebody, whether it's an existing patient or a new patient? How do you approach it, and what are some strategies that you can share to those listening to this that might either know somebody that would benefit from it, or they would personally benefit from it?
So the first thing I tell people is that PTSD is a superpower, which is a bit controversial sometimes, and people look at me funny. But some of the people I've said it to, it's been absolutely life-changing, because they've been suffering with PTSD and trying to run away from it, trying to stop it from happening, and getting more and more miserable as they try to fight it off. So I like to kind of compare it to, and I use a lot of DC Marvel comics in my therapy, is to think about Spider-Man when he first gets his powers, and he's got web shooting out of his hands. He doesn't know how to control it. He's getting stuck to the ceiling and falling off buildings and all of those sorts of things. And I tell people that PTSD is the same. So it's a functional adaptation that turned up to keep you alive. And if you think about it that way, it kept you alive in combat. It keeps you alive out on the street. It keeps you alive in prison. It keeps you alive in whatever circumstance you need it, because it keeps you aware and alert. So you know where your threats are. You know where your exits are. Your body is ready to run, to climb, to fight, all of those things. And the parts of your brain that aren't required at that moment, such as, doing abstract thinking, communicating with other people, those sorts of functions get shut down and you're running on instinct. So it was a really important thing. It wouldn't let you go to sleep, all of that stuff. So if we think about it that way, think about it as a friend and try to make friends with it, sometimes it just takes that pressure off people and they start thinking about it in a different, more positive way. The other part of it is that I often make people watch the movie Venom, if you've seen that, which is, this big, scary alien dude that's inside this mild-mannered journalist. And he comes out and he's really, really destructive. He destroys the entire place. But he also keeps that guy safe, right? So when the bad guys come, Venom comes out and he keeps him safe. But where Venom's not helpful is when he tries to go to a restaurant or when he tries to go on a date, these sorts of things. He's out of control. And he's too big and too destructive. And so I'm talking to people about there's this great, amazing superpower you now have with this unimaginable power. However, we have to learn to turn it down when we don't need it. And people can then start taking control. Like, okay, that makes more sense. I've got this, this guy that's turning up to help me and look after me. But it's not helpful when I'm sitting on the couch, trying to watch TV with my kids or pay attention to my friend's conversation. So that's how I start to look at it.
These podcasts have been brought to you by Better Financial Planning Australia. To book a free 15-minute phone chat, visit betterfinancialplanning.com.au. Yeah, I love that. I like that too. And I haven't seen the movie Venom, by the way, but I will watch it now because, I know who Venom is. Like, is that dark character with the
teeth?
I think I know who Venom is. Yeah, with the teeth, with the teeth sticking out.
Yeah.
I love that you come at it from that approach as a superpower. Because Spider-Man, when he first got his powers, I was just watching it the other day with the kids. Like, he's confused, doesn't know what's going on, and it's that functional adaptation that turned up to in his case. Initially, it wasn't to keep him alive, but it literally kept him alive after that.
Yeah.
And because when someone is in combat and on the street and in prison, and there's that, obviously that staying aware, staying alert, it's mentally draining. Like in any situation, actually staying aware and alert.
Yeah.
So I think, and this is why I think those that haven't gone through something like that and haven't experienced a traumatic event, they can't relate to it, including me. I can't relate to what you see on a regular basis at all. So coming at it from a respectable point of view, obviously, I'm just my job is to try to understand it, and I think it's people like yourself, Danielle, that with the work that you do with Soldiers and Sirens that gives that support. Because you were telling me when we talked the other day that it's not something that's readily available, and it's what you offer through the charity is very, very different to many other organizations, if any.
Yeah. And the biggest thing we find is that, when you serve in those organizations, it's all about team. It's all about the effort that you have together. So you look after each other, you watch each other's backs, you're reliant on each other to keep each other alive. And mostly we don't get in those sorts of situations as civilians, That's a very unusual place to be. And what happens when people get out of those jobs is that civilian society doesn't really work like that. So most workplaces, you go to work as an individual person, and you might have friends and colleagues, but it's not like that. It's not that high risk kind of situation in which you really have to absolutely to your core trust the people that you're working with, because your life depends on it. That gives you this incredible bond for life. And when people get out of those organizations, what happens is that the PTSD tells them to stay away from everyone. It tells them that they're a burden. It tells them that they're dangerous to other people. And often I find people from these communities are scared of themselves. And that's part of the isolation. And so the big important thing that Soldiers and Sirens does is it gives people the opportunity to join a community again, and a community of like-minded people that are used to working in teams, that have similar values, that understand what it means to be in a life and death situation and run towards the danger instead of away from it. And that really close bond that you get, it's, people bond like family. It's really interesting, and they do it fast as well.
And also, are there any examples that that you can share? And obviously, without getting into detail, but of situations where there's somebody that you saw that you were helping that really didn't think that they would overcome the situation, overcome the trauma at all, and they didn't even think it was possible for them to get back to the life that they wanted to get back to, where through working with them and even through your charity, or whether it's through the charity or whether it's through the other work that you do, you are able to help that person navigate the trauma.
Lots and lots of people come to mind, which is lovely. And I think my favorite thing to see is when people make it through their journey and start giving back to the people on their way. That's my absolute favorite thing. So what happens, I guess, as well is people join our community. Some people are well, they just come to socialize or come to volunteer. And then some people are really unwell, and people have told me how absolutely terrified they were to come and see me the first day, or my other fabulous therapists that I had, and peer workers and wellness people, that they were terrified. They can't remember the drive there. They thought there was no hope. And sometimes I've had people 6 sessions later who are better, but I've had people who have taken 5 years and are still on their way, and that's okay as well. And I think everybody's different, and everybody's path to recovery is going to be different, and everybody needs different things and different people to get there in the end. And I also want people to know that if you're unwell, you are still a constructive member of society. You're still part of our community, and you still have a lot to offer. And we want you to be here and be part of our family.
And I think as well, when I'm a mental health first aider, so it's I've got some very limited training on this area, but one of the worst things that you can say to someone going through any mental event is to get over it, or to just turn the switch and you'll be right, or just ignore it, or just, it's like if somebody has a fear of spiders, for example, you can't just tell that person stop being scared of spiders, and it's not that easy for them mentally to tell themselves, spiders, they're not going to hurt me. That they can't help how they feel, because like what you said earlier, it's their mind is telling them one thing, but their body is telling them something else, because and it's storing that memory, which is the struggle. And I think, going back to what we said at the start, the lived experiences, the passion and the love for what you do, and being part of that community. You can't put that into words, can you?
No, it's absolutely amazing. And I've seen, I've got so many different people in my head that I'm thinking about, but people you wouldn't recognize years later, people
Wow.
who were drinking, maybe the perpetrators of domestic violence, who were, making attempts on their life, self-harming, and then 3-4 years later, completely different person, like amazing change. It's incredible to see, and it's up to those people. So it's not me doing anything magic. I have some psych information that I know, but they know themselves best. They know what works and what doesn't. And some of the things I say are going to be helpful, and they can take them on board and start actioning them. And some of them aren't. Some of them might not relate to them, and that's all right as well. And it's that real partnership between the therapist or the community or And I think that's the other thing. It could be anybody. It doesn't have to be a mental health professional. It could be a fabulous friend. It could be a partner. It could be, a community sporting club. Who knows? But it's something that helps that person move forward and keep going. And I think as well, the biggest thing I see is when people take ownership and responsibility for their own recovery. That's when everything changes. As soon as people are like, do you know what? I'm going to get better. I don't know how long it's going to take. I don't know what I'm going to need, but I'm going to do it. That's when I see like huge, huge shifts. It's amazing. And people get really stuck for lots and lots of different reasons. And it's not their fault. That's just where they are at that particular time. And the more I work in mental health and in inpatient settings as well, the more I see, like, do you know what? Sometimes people aren't ready, and no amount of therapy or reassurance or medication or anything is going to get them over the line and start what they need to do, because they're not there yet. And hopefully they will get there, and then we can provide all of the information and all of the services. And I think that's the really scary bit, is when people aren't ready and they think that there's only one way out. That's what we want to prevent. And the community is protective, I think, of that. And that's where we can prevent suicide, is by making people feel like they're really part of a community, they're really welcomed, they're integral to it and really important to that community. Because when people feel like they're a burden and they feel like they don't belong, that's when people start going down that pathway.
And if somebody feels like they are ready, or they don't, but they want to talk to someone, or they want to seek help, what would be the first step, or one of the first steps that you'd suggest that person can take?
So I think it's anywhere that people feel safe to say, I'm not all right and I need some help and I don't know what to do next. So like I say, it doesn't have to be a psychologist. It could be they talk to their doctor first. It could be that they talk to their partner, to a mate, ring a helpline, go to church, go to their sporting club, like wherever it is, it doesn't matter. Go somewhere to say, I need help. And if you don't get it there, then try somewhere else. I think that's the thing. And, Soldiers and Sirens is always there. We've got various ways of getting in contact with us so that we can point people in the right direction, because the mental health system is sometimes really difficult to navigate. There's lots and lots of services out there, and, it's hard to know what you might need. Do you need referrals? How much are things going to cost? Where do you go? How do you start? And that stuff's really overwhelming when you're already at capacity trying to manage your PTSD or your depression or your anxiety or your OCD or whatever's happening to you, or just your life crises, because sometimes it isn't a diagnosable condition. Sometimes stuff just happens to us. People die, people lose their jobs, people's houses catch on fire, all sorts of horrendous things. Global pandemics happen, and sometimes we don't feel very good about things, and that's okay as well. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. In fact, it means everything's working perfectly.
The way it should be working.
Yeah.
And Danielle, if somebody wants to get in contact with yourself or Soldiers and Sirens, and if they want to support Soldiers and Sirens, how can they do that?
So we're on Facebook, is probably the place that we are the most, because our demographic tends to be kind of 30 to 70-year-old, mostly males, but lots of females as well, from those serving communities. So Facebook's kind of the place that we are. We're also on Instagram, though. I'm on LinkedIn. Soldiers and Sirens is on LinkedIn, but most of our content is on my LinkedIn, so Danielle Baldock. We've got a website, which is www.soldiersandsirens, all spelt out, .com.au, which has links back to Facebook, to our events, and some information about the board and things like that. You can also contact me at the Marion Centre. So it's Danielle.Baldock, BALDOCK, at aurorahealth.com.au. if people are needing inpatient admission, or if they would like to find out what sort of groups we have at the Marion Centre and do some group therapy, that's a possibility. Or just if people want to get in contact and find places around Perth where they can get really good quality counselling, individual one-on-one. Or if they're looking to get involved in ex-serving organisations, there's some fabulous groups out there. So Soldiers and Sirens also collaborates with people, organisations like Buddy Up, which is military and first responder run. They do sport, they do community things, they do volunteering. So they do lots of different things that it's not mental health specific, but it helps everybody's mental health. So they're an amazing organisation. And we collaborate with many other organisations as well, and we're talking to them all the time. And we had some great forums and things recently as well where we're all collaborating together. So there's a big network out there. It's just starting, finding a door to open and then finding everything else from there.
Yeah, and also if anyone's listening to this that can offer funding as well, or know somebody that can help to also touch base as well, Danielle, just to support you and the team for the amazing work that you do.
Definitely. So we'd had a federal government grant from the Department of Communities, which was very generous and allowed us to start up and have an office and run a service. Unfortunately, with COVID, like many things, that grant came to an end and doesn't exist anymore. And a lot of the funding out there is for various different mental health related things, but there's no funding for first responder mental health. Just I think not thought of as a special population at the moment. And a lot of businesses were struggling and couldn't help us either. We ran on, Medicare rebates and DVA as much as we could, but we wanted our service to be free because we didn't want anyone to feel like that was a barrier to getting help. And we wanted people to be able to pick up the phone and get an appointment, within the week, which we did. But it was difficult. We had 5 staff. So we've moved the psychology service of Soldiers and Sirens into the Marion Centre. But like I say, we still have lots and lots of links to many different organisations and therapy services as well that can help. And so Soldiers and Sirens, I guess, has evolved now where that community, which we realised from talking to our members is the most important thing, is that's what we're going to be really focusing on now, is how do we provide opportunities to join our community. So we have coffee catch-ups at various locations on various days, and they're facilitated by our volunteers who are all current and ex-serving members themselves and have had lived experience of mental health as well as uniform service. We have the Soldiers and Sirens Shield, which is an ice hockey match between first responders and armed services every year, which is just such a great atmosphere. And it's one of those events where lots and lots of people come from all over Perth, and sometimes that's the yearly kind of catch-up is in that ice hockey crowd, which is awesome. We also have the WA Services Cup, which is a powerlifting competition between all the different services. Absolutely amazing just spirit in that room. I am a bodybuilder. I've never been to powerlifting until I started going to the WA Services Cup, and Sam Murphy puts that on for us, and he's a Navy veteran and just a really kind soul, and runs the Power Pit in Rockingham, and they have this just amazing culture of inclusivity, of looking after each other, encouraging each other, and to go to a competition where people were giving each other tips and tricks to do better lifts, even though they were competing, was just such an amazing, beautiful thing to see. So highly recommend that event, whether you want to lift heavy things around or not. We've also had Evan Jackson from Homicide Squad put on some creative wellbeing workshops. So we did woodworking and Aboriginal art and I can't remember all of them, but lots of different art. And we had art teachers rather than art therapists. So again, it was not specifically about mental health, but it helps people's mental health at the same time.
And just interacting with each other and just, building that community that you talked about, which I can tell you're so passionate about as well.
Yeah, it's just such a lovely community to be a part of too. And I love that, like I always say, you can be unwell and still welcomed, where you might feel ostracized or ashamed in other places in the world. You can come to our community and you'll just be welcomed. And you can be well too. So you might not have ever experienced mental ill health, but you want to just hang out with people who've served in uniform. And we also encourage that too.
Just to hang out
Yeah.
and have a laugh.
And I think that reduces the stigma because nobody knows, when you turn up, whether you're well or not. And it doesn't matter to us, really. We just want you to be there.
Yeah, that's so true. Thank you, Danielle. It's been a very, very insightful episode. It's, I think many people listening to this will either have learnt a lot, can either relate or even partially, potentially, or would know somebody that would probably benefit from listening to this episode. And I encourage everyone listening to this to support Soldiers and Sirens and to help spread the word. And it really means a lot, Danielle, that you've made the time for today. Lastly, with all my episodes, I like to finish off with a dad joke.
Perfect.
And this one's one of my favorite ones, actually. But how do celebrities stay cool?
How?
They have lots of fans.
Nice.
Lots of fans. Which I'm sure you do in the community. And I know you do because I've
said our community has many excellent dad jokes because a lot of
good.
Yes.
Well, honestly, if I was in Perth, I'd definitely be there because I've got a couple I can share. My son got me a book recently with dad jokes, and it's good. I never remember them, but I love pumping them out and dropping them randomly when they come to mind. But no, thank you, Danielle. Again, really appreciate your time, and and I'll put the link to the to your website in the description of this episode as well, so that people can click on that and visit it straight from there.
Awesome.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for joining us on Sharing More Than the Sheets. Please make sure you subscribe to be updated with future episode releases, and feel free to share this episode with any friends or family that you think it might benefit. Please visit us at sharingmorethanthesheets.com.au to submit questions or requests for future podcast topics. These podcasts have been brought to you by Better Financial Planning Australia. To book a 15-minute phone chat, visit betterfinancialplanning.com.au.